This session is entitled, I think, Drug Policy Learning from Mistakes. I have learned from a mistake I made 2 years ago, which was to turn up with a long-sleeve shirt and a jacket. Remember how hot it was? So I'm feeling much more comfortable this time around, and I'm unencumbered by that, although I have actually since then acquired one of these accessories, because the amount of stuff we have to carry around is quite extraordinary. Anyway, very kind of the organisers to invite me back. It's very kind of you to come and attend this session, and I hope that we're going to have a really good discussion afterwards. My perspective is from the policing angle, but it's interesting that listening to the other presentations, there is a great deal of synergy between what you've heard from Danny's kind of global, if you like, perspective, looking at really all of the big strategic issues, from absolutely narrowing down to an individual tragedy. And just on that point, being a police officer, you are allowed to walk towards the stuff that's going wrong or that's interesting, whereas others are kept out of it. The big lie in policing is when you've got that plastic tape and it says, the officer says, there's nothing to see here, there is everything to see. Human life is fascinating. It's tragic, but it's fascinating. But what it did to me, and I think many colleagues, is actually opened my eyes to the fact that people who are allegedly criminals for using banned substances are actually often very damaged and vulnerable people. And that's a perspective I think you can get from being a police officer. I know you may think many police officers think differently, and of course many do, but I think many also get it. And then Ben's terrific session, again, I was thinking, yes, this is it. I use some of your stuff, whether I've actually acknowledged it or not, but because I think all police officers, we don't just talk in terms of the law. Policing is very much dealing with humanity, if you like, at its best and at its worst. They estimate that only 30% of a police officer's time is spent dealing. I've been told that I like to wander. I've been given barriers with it, so I can stay in shot. But only 30% of police time is spent dealing actually with crime itself, if you like. And so most of it is just dealing with people, and if you like, to try and serve and protect. And I can say it now, that it's clear that when you're dealing with drug law enforcement, you are not serving the people. Even if the people think you are, as you've heard from Danny and others, you're actually causing more harm than good by enforcing the drug laws. And certainly the people that you arrest and prosecute aren't being helped by that. So that's the kind of background that I come from, and over a period of time, as a result of hopefully keeping my mind open, listening to things and looking at things, I've come to the position I have today. So what I'd like you to do perhaps is just imagine a world, this world, where, and it's quite possible, because if you look at that new psychoactive substances bill, you've got a government, and I don't think it's just a Tory government, frankly. You've got a government that really thinks that it can do extraordinary things at a level of stupidity which confounds all of the evidence that's out there. So imagine, if you will, police officers kicking doors down to arrest people in their own homes for committing homosexual acts, or for worshipping the Pope, or for being Muslims. And it's very hard, actually, to think that that might happen. But in relation to drugs, it is happening. And to my mind, it's actually very similar. It's not often perceived as being similar, but it is, because what you've got, and there's a distinction in crimes which the Romans understood, and they distinguished between crimes that were malum in se, which means evil of themselves, things like assault and things like theft of property. It's quite clear that's one individual harming another. And the other class of offence is malum prohibitum, which, not surprisingly, means that the evil is only created because the actions are being prohibited. And that's what's happened with the drug laws. So I think even from a legal perspective, any government is on very dodgy grounds when it is enforcing a law that interferes with people's decisions to live their lives in particular ways. And we did hear from Ben and I'm not sure if Danny as well, the motivation for the drug laws. It's not about health, it's about oppression, and it is about racism. And on the point of racism, there are perhaps 500,000 police stops every year, you know, a stop in the street in order to detect crime. Half of those are in pursuit of finding drugs on somebody's person. So that's 250,000 people stopped, there may be multiples, but stopped every year by the police with a 7% success rate. Success being the ability to prosecute somebody for possessing a substance that alters their state of mind. So that's the police service that we currently are signed up to. And it makes me feel ashamed. I mean, I like to think as a police officer I did a lot of good, but I also know that when it came to drug law enforcement, I actually did cause more harm than good. Okay, we probably all agree that prohibition is wrong and it has to end. I think the discussion afterwards will take us forward on perhaps methods for doing that. I've got some ideas, but what I wanted to do first was to kind of run through in a little bit more detail some of the harms caused by policing, and then maybe offer what it might look like, some ideas of what it might look like if prohibition had ended. And hopefully that'll just give us an opportunity to spring off what I've been saying. It may not be original. It's very difficult to know with an audience like this, because some of you, I suspect, are psychic. And even if you haven't heard me speak before, you know what I'm going to say. But bear with me if under those circumstances you've heard it before. There's a financial cost, estimated at 16 billion. And that could just be, well, it's hard to tell what the policing costs are out of that, but certainly 2 or 3 billion perhaps. Then you've got the court costs, the prison costs, and you've got a massive amount of money, billions, being spent on something that's a failure. And remember, this is in the context of Theresa May, Home Secretary before the Home Affairs Select Committee in September 2-3 years ago, saying, in answer to a question, well, no, I don't know of any evidence that drug law enforcement works, but I think it does. That is the evidential basis for our policy, as stated on record by the Home Secretary. So we're spending all of this money without there being any evidence that it does any good, but growing evidence that it does harm. I think there's also a legitimacy cost. This is about when you've got 2/3 of the population saying maybe we ought to try the Portuguese experiment with decriminalisation, and that was in a survey not so long ago. When you've actually got about 3/4 of the members of Parliament as polled saying we don't think that drug prohibition is working, and yet you've got a police service which is enforcing it, you've got a mismatch between what the citizens think, and increasingly are not, obviously some think it's a good idea, they're misguided, and I say that without patronising, but 40 years of lies and myths from the media means an awful lot of people are going to believe what they read in the papers. I think I believe some stuff I read in the papers about which I know little, for example, financial markets and the like. I've probably been led by the nose at that, and I'd be one of the misguided people because I don't know the truth in that area. But we have got, I think, a real problem with the police service enforcing laws that increasingly are seen not to be working and seem to be expensive and seem to be against what the public wants. The other legitimacy issue arises when police interact with young people. And there's an issue here because the police are charged with keeping law and order. The primary object, if you like, of a state is to maintain the external boundaries against invasion by enemies and to keep law and order so citizens can go about their business. And of course the police obviously have a duty to try and do that. Well, some people don't want to behave well, and so the police do use force, get in people's faces. It is often a very robust and violent issue. And of course what often happens is that young people are testing the boundaries And they'll test the boundaries with their parents, with their teachers, with themselves, and with the police. And frankly, the police aren't going to lose. And so you get a conflict. If you give the police what is in effect a random stop and search power, I know in Lloyd isn't random, you've got to have just cause, but it may be no secret for me to enable you to understand that maybe that isn't always adhered to in practice, as opposed to in accordance with the law and policy. I mean, that's in the nature of human beings and their behaviour. So you've got this real recipe for conflict and mistrust. And we've seen that going back really quite a long time, the early 80s, in the Brixton riots. And of course, much more recently we had riots. And a lot of that is young people's anger focused on law and order. And I think that drug law enforcement is actually a big part of kind of stoking that resentment and potentially stoking that violence. And the other problem, it's a kind of, I call it a kind of legitimacy problem. It's just part of the stupidity. Police are rewarded for arrests, stops, that sort of activity, and seizures of drugs. But these bear no relation to, and as measures have certainly not contributed to, in fact, the opposite's happened, to the stated aim of drug law enforcement policy, which is to reduce supply and to reduce consumption. So you do have this problem where the police are merrily being applauded. How many of you open up your local paper and you see drugs bust, and Detective Sergeant so-and-so or Detective Inspector so-and-so says, this successful raid means that we do not tolerate drugs in Brighton, in Roehampton, in Cambridge. It's all nonsense. But this is seen as somehow a measure of success. I won't deal with the personal cost because I think that's already been covered, but it's quite clearly outrageous for the police to be prosecuting people. And not, I mean, the police is the spearhead, the gatekeepers of the criminal justice system, who have been using substances to take away the pain of childhood abuse. Social cost. The social cost, I mean, there's, your insurance bills are much higher and all those sorts of things, but you think about some of the places where street drug dealing is rife and how communities are subjugated to the will of the dealers who use violence to protect their territory, either from rival dealers or from citizens who might want to tell the police what's going on. And that happens all over the country. Sadly, I wasn't surprised when I moved from London after 25 years to Cambridgeshire to discover exactly the same in all of the cities, towns and villages of rural Cambridgeshire. And that's where the so-called drug law enforcement has left us in this country. We are overwhelmed by it. And there is a huge social cost just in terms of community stability. There's also a huge social cost because we enrich criminals to a very large extent. It's estimated that £6 billion is the price of the size of the market in the UK. And that money goes into subverting the way we think things should be done. Because that money is used to fund other criminal activity. It is used to corrupt police officers. When I worked as a detective superintendent investigating complaints against police officers, the biggest complaint was against detective sergeants. Detective sergeants are at a sufficiently high rank to be able to lead raids to relatively mid-level drug dealers. And they will come across a stash of cash that is sometimes many times their annual salary. And it's lying there. And drug offences are interesting, rather like corruption, because neither side wants to tell the police what they've done. You don't go to your local police station and say, look, I've just committed a crime because I bought some cannabis off a street dealer. It doesn't happen. And so you've got this opportunity for the criminal to say, if you take half the money, I get a lesser sentence. And that's a real reality and a kind of social cost. Perhaps in this country, for whatever reason, it's not as bad. I've travelled to Latin America where it's endemic. They say we can't get elected to be president in many of those countries unless you're hand in hand with the drug cartels and the drug barons, the drug lords. Unusually, I'm keeping to my notes, and I'm also keeping to quite a good position at the request of the cameraman. The drug market also provides a great opportunity of employment for young children who often are seeking the support of a gang, who often dare not do anything other than join the gang for fear of being ostracized and weak and exposed and vulnerable. And there are sufficient rewards for that to happen. So that's just another small social cost small social cost. Racism. Of those stop and searches, if you're black, you're 7 times more likely to be stopped. If you're of sort of Indian, Asian origin, 3 times more likely than a white person to be stopped. And the chances of being arrested after that stop is much greater if you're black. And the chances of being prosecuted is much greater. And the chances of getting a conviction and a prison sentence is much greater. This information was unearthed by that wonderful organisation Release. So if you want to pursue that any further, just go to their website and you'll find all the detail there. And again, the problem there is that you have got a police service engaged in a really low return activity, 7%, for something that doesn't really matter, having a bit of cannabis or MDMA or whatever it is in your pocket, which is alienating generation after generation of young black kids. And then we wonder why we may have a race problem in this country. There's a lost opportunity cost, because every time the police, and I know because I've been there, as a young cop I was arresting people for possession of drugs, and as I graduated up through the system, I came in charge of big operations which took forever. It took, some of them hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pounds worth of resources. At the end of a year and a half, we would lock up Mr. Big, and he'd go away and he'd spend some time in one of these high security prisons. We had been in Cambridgeshire, Whitehall. Mind you, the IRA escaped out of there. They made a gun out of some soap. I don't know if you remember that. It was wild, that. Not on my watch, thank God. Although I wasn't a prison governor, I was a chief police officer. But there's the lost opportunity cost while doing all of this, is not to investigate the malum in se, the evil in themselves. You see, actually in America there's quite good evidence. When Nixon created this war on drugs in 1971, the drug squads went up and young undercover officers would go and join a group of students, travel with one of them up to the big town to score the drugs for the weekend, and then arrest him for being a drug dealer. Sent to prison, no more college, and all the rest of it. But what also happened is the detections for homicide and rape and those sorts of offences started dropping. That, to me, is another real issue with the kind of police involvement, because all the time spent on that, it's not just of itself, it's a waste of money. But given limited resources, it also means that people are far less protected as ordinary citizens. And of course, actual burglary and robbery and shoplifting increases because of people seeking to fund their drug habits. So you're creating crime for the police to investigate. And any householder, if you go to householders, I've just been burgled, and I'm on the end of the phone. Yes, what's happening? He said, well, I come home, after collecting the kids from school. Very common time, that time of the afternoon. Television's gone, and a few mobile phones are gone, etc., etc. No, the mobile phones wouldn't go, because mobile phones are on everybody's hip, aren't they? Or they used to be. Remember when that was cool? Yeah, you kind of walked around, hey, mobile phone. And my response would be, well, can I advise you to speak to your local MP to repeal Prohibition, because that's actually the cause of your burglary. Feel tempted sometimes, but the point, all of that's got to be done, and then you can't. And I know this because I was in command of all the resources. And you might say to me, well, why don't you stop investigating drug offences? I'm sworn to uphold the law. That's the law. Democratically elected government passes that law. I may disagree with it, I may argue against it, but I do have a duty. And that was it was an issue. It was, I think, cognitive dissonance is probably something that in this audience is well understood, not in every audience. I studied philosophy and psychology many years ago, and I think that's where I learned that. There is a cost I better get on with it. We've got time for discussion, so it won't matter. There's a cost to the truth. Okay. We need to be very clear to anybody, but young children especially, what we say about what harms, what benefits substances can do to them. I don't believe in drugs education in school. I believe in education in school about the world. And you will teach a child and make available to them the truth about things like salt and fat and cannabis and alcohol as part of the whole programme. And there is some research. There's an American psychologist, his name just escapes me, who said that these sorts of approaches tend to work far better than certainly a cop coming in and saying, you know, don't take this stuff or you'll be arrested. Because it might work on some of the kids, but the ones who don't give a fig about authority in any case aren't going to listen to that. And we heard that. And they're just it's a red rag to a bull. So that doesn't work. I mean, you can discuss. I did speak to some school kids, and I said, look, some of you are going to be tempted to take substances, psychoactive substances, drugs. And I said, I haven't got much advice, and Ben, don't listen to this bit. I said, but if you're going to, grow your own known strain of cannabis and use that, because at least you'll know what you're getting. Anything else you wouldn't get. And it was a risky thing to say because of the effect on young kids, but better than all the alternatives. And that's a message you will hear from me. I do not preach perfection. Control and regulation of drugs, graded according to potential for harm and good, is not going to be perfect, but it's going to be a shed load better. But so truth. So anyway, this Gordon Brown, when he was Prime Minister, sitting on the sofa, I think, you know, where that was probably in, you know, the BBC whatever programme, says, well, of course, this skunk cannabis is lethal. And that's just a kind of, you know, one of the most idiotic things people say about drugs. But any kid, anybody listening to that who has, you know, any sense, and put it this way, anybody who has ever taken cannabis, consumed cannabis, or knows somebody, knows that it isn't. Therefore, the Prime Minister of this country lies, doesn't know anything. Why should I listen to him about anything else? Warrington Council, and the People Power got Warrington Council, I just heard of this, it wasn't in my notes, I just remembered it. They said, smoking cannabis is as bad as taking heroin. And they put this on posters, they didn't remember that. And there was actually a kind of revolt on Twitter, on Facebook, whatever, when Facebook, I don't use Facebook much now, it's for older people. I'm 63, that was a good, thank you for laughing. But the thing was, there was enough, and they withdrew it. Because, of course, the kid's going to go, oh, well, I may as well use heroin then. There's no problem with cannabis, because my town council says so. Truth is an issue. The Daily Mail has been mentioned. It's not just truth, it is kind of skin-crawling horribleness. There's a better word, but, you know, do you know how they described that tragedy, the murder of 38 people? It was Peter Hitchens, and he said, the cannabis smoking killer. That's the label, he puts that in front of everybody. Remember that soldier Rigby, they were cannabis. So anybody who smokes cannabis is automatically a killer in his eyes. The trouble is, he has a following, and it gets publicity. Again, truth is being sacrificed on this ridiculous sort of pursuit of a war on drugs. And as Ben said, and it's so encouraging, and I think, Danny, you said it as well, it's a war on people. And it's a war on the vulnerable. Because it's the vulnerable, according to evidence, who are more likely to be problematic drug users, the dispossessed, the people actually in need of support, not punishment. And I'll tell you what, if you think that's a problem over here, go to some Latin American countries, and Malaysia and Indonesia and places like that. It's absolutely outrageous how a whole raft of people, just 2 years imprisonment for any sort of drug abuse. I'll move down, okay. Oh yeah, controlled drugs. The government controls drugs, not true. The criminals control drugs, true. So there's a distortion of the idea that we have controlled drugs. False reporting of scientific research. I mean, not just distortion has happened to you then. The fact is that it regularly comes out that Daily Mail again, but it's others, you know, smoking one reefer can give you psychosis, can give you schizophrenia. That actually came out. And I think it was an experiment not done with cannabis on a mouse. I'm not quite sure how you tell if a mouse has schizophrenia. Perhaps it doesn't run away from cats or something. It thinks they're its friend, but you know, I don't know. Anyway, the thing is, we try and make light of it, because otherwise it's so bloody depressing. Oh, and the reporting of deaths from substance abuse. This was a Scottish researcher did this. Over 100% of ecstasy deaths are reported. You virtually never hear of anybody dying of, you know, sort of paracetamol or alcohol. Think of it, what, 80-odd thousand a year? How many actually get reported? Very, very few. So there's this whole distortion, these lies, these myths. And this is actually one of the big barriers to change, because a lot of the population, not surprisingly, buy into it. Because how could they know any better? Almost even if they wanted to. I'm retired, I've got time on my hands. And I'm quite an inquisitive person, so I like to find stuff out. Oh, I've done that, good. Yeah. War on drugs and war on people, done that, done that, done that. See, normally I don't refer to my notes on the grounds that I have a kind of, maybe an inflated sense of self-confidence. I'll kind of cover the areas I want to cover without having to refer to my notes. Well, on this occasion, it's not doing too badly. Now, what would it look like in 2 minutes? What would the future look like in 2 minutes? We could divert money to social programs, instead of away from policing, into social programs of some sort. The big drivers, if it's poverty, neglect, then that's what you deal with. And then people can grow up, use substances, but not become addicted. Just get the good bits out of it. On education, tell the truth, proper treatment and support. Because even if overnight we changed away from prohibition to some control regulation, an awful lot of people with problems, but they're not getting proper treatment and support because it's penny pinching. And I know this not just from kind of research, but I know people who have. I mean, there's a person that I communicate with reasonably regularly. If you like to keep my feet on the ground about the real world, who first took heroin when she was 13, and went through the sort of. She said, "I don't want to be dishonest. I won't steal, but I will sell my body because that's not dishonest." This is a crazy mixed-up world we put kids through. She's now in her mid to late 20s, hopefully coming off methadone this summer. So, you know, there's a real opportunity properly to treat people, the underlying issues, not just... The problem is, people just say, you know, oh, it's all about the drugs, and it often isn't. It's actually about other issues which underlie it. And if those can be dealt with, then the need is taken away. There will be a renaissance of police-community relations. There will be much more hugging and kissing between police officers and members of the public. Some of that will be desirable. Some of that, no doubt, will get reported to the authorities, which of course could be the offender under these new circumstances. Of course, I joke about that, but actually I do believe that would be the case. You would have a different relationship, a relationship based on a much more kind of shared sense of legitimacy about what the police are doing. And the fact is, if you start stopping more burglaries and more rapes and more serious crimes, the Marlem in say crimes, then the population is going to get behind you an awful lot more. Evidence would have been acknowledged. And I think this would leak to other areas. Because the only way you are going to change this is by, we've got to operate on hearts and minds, emotions, telling stories, get the public to exhort their politicians to change, but ultimately this will be based on the evidence. And that, I think, will be very helpful, because that will leak across to a lot of other areas of public policy. Serious and organised crime is not going to go away. There'll be a sort of balloon effect. Criminals will go into other activities. But, remember, better, not perfect. But there's less profit in other crimes than in drugs. The London bank robbers used to shoot it out with a Sweeney on the streets of London, and by and large lose. It's a dangerous business being a bank robber, because the Sweeney Todd flying squad might shoot you. They turn to drug dealing, much safer and much more profitable. But remember, if the police aren't wasting all of their time on drug law enforcement, they'll be able to tackle the serious and organised criminality that undermines and subverts our society. reduction in crime of all sorts, not just the reported crime, but all the other crimes consequent on other matters. Is there something big happening at 12 somewhere else? There is, isn't there? Better than me? Come on, guys.
It's only lunch.
I'm over time. The lies, myths and distortions in the media won't stop, but they'll move on to another target. So at least in this area, we'll have it. I mean, that's me being a bit pessimistic, because I say it's not going to be a perfect world, but maybe it'll be a bit better, and maybe they will actually learn and be chastened by what's happening. But sadly, we do have an appetite, and I know it's just too... We do have an appetite for kind of bad news, salacious gossip, and the like. Drugs themselves, much more dangerous when the criminals are in charge of production and supply. So the drugs themselves, of course, will be safer. And so there's far less chance. Probably much you'd eliminate accidental deaths from drugs. And probably, as I said, I'm looking for a better world, not a perfect world. I hope my talk today has been good, because it won't have been perfect. But if you have been listening, thanks very much indeed.